Hello, today is November 16th, 2017, and my name is Thomas Wright. And today I'm with Mr. Bob Corcaran, and we're here today as part of the Salem Witch Trials Descendant Oral History Project. So, I see you were born in New York. Did you grow up there?
No, I was born in upstate New York, but my family moved to Connecticut shortly after, and I grew up in Western Massachusetts. We moved there when I was 4 years old and went to college there, and moved to Eastern Massachusetts right after college. So I really think of myself as growing up in Massachusetts.
All right. How'd you like Western Mass, by the way, growing up there?
It was great. We lived in Amherst, where UMass is. My father was a professor at UMass. And Amherst is a great town to grow up in because because of the university and the other colleges in the consortium, there's a lot going on, culturally, artistically. And when you're a junior or senior in high school, there's a lot of frat parties going on too that you can sneak into. At least you could back then. I don't know if you still can. So that was kind of fun. And all this is just surrounded by a very beautiful area out in the countryside. So it was a great place to grow up.
That's really cool. So, what was your first job out of college, and kind of what were some of the things that you studied as well when you were in college?
Well, I'll start with college because I can remember that more easily. I majored in American Studies, which is a concentration in history and American literature. I went to Amherst College, and I wrote my thesis on the architecture and village planning of the Shakers. I've had an interest in antique buildings and furniture and so on, American antique buildings and furniture since as long as I can remember.
Interesting.
And it sort of manifested itself in a focus on the Shakers when I was in college. After graduating from college, I had been planning to go to law school, but I wasn't sure about that, so I decided to take a year off. And I found myself drifting around, not sure what I really wanted to do for a job, but I ended up as a temporary secretary working for Fidelity Investments in downtown Boston, typing. And I was a very good typist. And after about 3 or 4 days, they asked if I wanted to interview to become a customer service phone rep. And I did. It was a job. It was a long-term job. And I settled there and abandoned any thoughts of going to law school and began a career in financial services at Fidelity.
Awesome. Very cool. So you are a descendant of Rebecca Nurse, and
yes.
So I wanted to ask you, when and how did you first learn you were related to Rebecca Nurse?
This happened in 1986. I've been interested in genealogy since I was 8 years old, and it's been a hobby of mine since that time. I became curious in the Nurse family. I was curious for years and years and years, but really focused my curiosity in 1986. There's nothing special about that particular date, it's just when it happened. I was researching various families I was descended from who lived in southern Vermont, a small town called Dummerston, it's just north of Brattleboro. Probably 1,000 people live there today, and even fewer in the 1700s. And I was familiar with a history of that county and of that particular town that was written in the 1880s, and there's a copy of which I can picture right now is in my grandmother's library. It's now my uncle's library. And it is one of these books that at the age of 8, people in my family said, oh, you're interested in this sort of stuff? Oh, well, here's a town and a county history of where some of our ancestors lived back in the 1700s.
Right.
Okay. In this history book, every family in town managed to get their genealogy into the book.
Interesting.
Everybody was there, except for the wife of one of my ancestors. His family was there, and his mother's family was there, but his wife's family wasn't in the book. Her name was Betty Nurse.
Right.
And for the longest time, I thought it very peculiar that everybody else in town had their genealogy in this book, but Betty Nurse did not. So for some reason, in the 1986, I just my focus shifted to her. I don't really know why, and became more and more curious about the absence of any information about her in this particular book. Now, I'd already known about Rebecca Nurse from history classes, and even as a child, I had child-oriented American history books at home, and my brothers and I did. And I remember as a child reading a child-targeted history of the Salem witchcraft trials. Mm. So I was familiar with the name Rebecca Nurse from maybe since I was 10 years old,
right.
and familiar with the names of other characters in that episode, Tituba and the Parises and the Putnams and so on.
Right.
And there had been a lingering question in my mind of, gee, wouldn't it be interesting if this Betty Nurse, who I can't find anything about, and this Rebecca Nurse, who I've heard about in history,
right.
were somehow connected. So I finally decided to get focused on this. And I did so. What I did was actually focus on the rest of this town history book, not just the genealogies, but I've never actually read the history of this particular town. And so I did so, and I stumbled across a man called Solomon Nurse, who was living in this town in the 1700s. And I thought, well, isn't this interesting? How this town is tiny. How many family members of the same Nurse family could there be? This Solomon Nurse guy, whoever he is, and this Betty Nurse lady, they must somehow be related. And there was a reference in this history book with respect to Solomon Nurse to Solomon having previously lived in a town called Rutland, Massachusetts, which is in Worcester County. Right. So I followed a hunch and said, all right, let me see if I can find out anything about this Solomon Nurse from Rutland, Massachusetts. And it just one thing led to another.
Right.
From there.
You said earlier that you had an interest in genealogy since you were 8. What sparked that interest at such a young age?
I love this story. Each summer, my parents and brothers and I would go visit my grandparents in Western New York State, where my mother grew up. And this one particular summer, when I was 8 years old, my grandfather took me and one of my brothers to a local state park, it's out in the middle of the woods, a place called Rock City, which is a collection of glacier formations, huge boulders and rock formations that were carved and or left by the glaciers, how many millions of years ago. And as he was taking my brother and me around through the woods, showing us all these really cool, huge glacier deposit things, he took us to this one huge boulder that was, it must have been 15 feet tall and 20 or 30 feet across. It was immense, out in the middle of the woods. And it was covered with hundreds of carved initials. Over the years, people had taken hammer and chisel to carve their initials into the rock. And he made a point of showing this to my brother and myself. And he said, well, your grandmother's parents carved their initials in this rock somewhere. And they were his in-laws, his wife's grandparents, so he couldn't remember their names in the moment. And he apologized, said, gee, I can't remember their names, otherwise we could look for their initials, but I can't remember. But there's a book at home that has the family genealogy in it, and you can read about them when we get home. And that was all I needed. So I said, okay, I want to find out who these grandparents of my grandparents are. And fortunately, my uncle had done a phenomenal amount of genealogy work in the 1950s, and that was this work that I was introduced to at age 8.
Right. It's very interesting having that connection, to actually the natural world as a spark to your interest.
Yeah.
Yes.
And it was a physical thing where both people took hammer and chisel and
Right.
did this themselves to leave their mark.
Right.
So it was something about the physical aspect of it that really captured my attention.
It's really cool. So you also mentioned in your bio as well, information coming out of the closet.
Yes.
At the same time.
Yes.
Of learning about Rebecca Nurse. How was this inspirational for you?
This is great. I am gay, and I came out of the closet in 1986. Coincidentally, right around the time when I was taking an interest in researching this Betty Nurse character, and could she possibly be connected to Rebecca Nurse. And so it was coincidence that I discovered this descent from Rebecca Nurse at the same time as I was going through the process of coming out of the closet.
Right.
And certainly once I'd done the genealogy to find the connection to Rebecca Nurse, that was in and of itself exciting to find a connection with a historical figure.
Right.
In addition to that, though, it was exciting is the wrong word. It was and moving isn't quite the right word either, but it was moving. It was inspirational. I'll come up with the right word. To read her testimony during her trial, and the gist of which, from my reading of it, was, I haven't done anything wrong. And why are you coming after me? I haven't done anything wrong.
Yes.
And that was a wonderful message to read and to feel some sort of connection to as I was going through this process of coming out.
Right.
And there are many times during the course of that spring and summer, it was probably a 6-month period that I think of as my coming out period, when I would turn to her testimony every few days to read it again. And it's only a few pages,
right.
but it was just wonderful to have a connection to someone who went through this horrible experience where her message was, I haven't done anything wrong.
Right.
So that was wonderful, and something of a gift.
That's awesome. Yeah. So what do you think is important for people to remember, or at least try to learn about the Salem witch trials that happened during that time of 1692 to 1693?
Oh, I haven't thought about that question before. My big takeaway from it, and maybe this would be useful for other people too, is that paranoia exists, and paranoia has not gone away.
Right. Exactly.
And so the easy connection is to bring up Arthur Miller's Crucible and put that in the context of McCarthyism, and that's, I don't think that's inaccurate, but everyone has done that already. That's old. But this notion of paranoia does exist, and it can and it does pop up again and again in very dangerous ways,
Right.
and insidious ways where people get drawn into it and may or may not realize they're getting drawn into it.
Yeah.
I think that's my biggest takeaway from the episode.
Very interesting. So I'd also ask you, how important do you think it is for us in general, for people in general, to try to, go back and try to study their genealogy?
I'm going to answer that question in a slightly different way. I'm going to answer that question in the context of what genealogy has meant to me at different times.
Right.
So, and my relationship to genealogy has changed multiple times. I'm 54 now, since I was 8 years old. Certainly, there's a time when finding a connection to a notable person in history was very exciting in and of itself.
Yes.
Rebecca Nurse, or a descent from someone on the Mayflower, or someone who was in the American Revolution. a connection with a specific historical event or person, that in and of itself is exciting. And that's something that absolutely motivated me for a long, long time. The older, there was a time, though, in my 30s when I lost a little bit of interest in genealogy because I got fixated on this notion of, well, whoever this famous person may have been, or whoever this person was who lived through a famous event was, it's not my accomplishment that I'm descended from that person. Yeah. I am the accident of lots of biological events that happened between that person and me.
Yes.
So it's not my doing. And once that idea lodged itself in my head, I put genealogy on the shelf. Didn't put it away, just tucked it away, just didn't focus on it so much. In my 40s and 50s, though, I've returned to genealogy, and part of this has been prompted by my nephews and nieces asking questions, and their children, more recently, their children are starting to ask questions too. And my husband asking questions about his ancestry. Right. And I've become drawn to this, or drawn back to an interest in genealogy, not with the purpose of trying to find descent from a famous person, not with the intent of finding descent from someone who lived through a famous event, like a Revolutionary War or Civil War or what have you, but rather to provide some context for time and place. So, for example, the last few years now, every year around March 17th, my father's family having come from Ireland, I'll use Facebook to send a photograph of one of the villages where some of our ancestors came from in Ireland to my nephews and nieces and their kids and say, hey, happy St. Patrick's Day. Right. This is the village where some of your ancestors came from. People who were as far removed from fame as you could be, and people who did not live, so far as I know, did not live through famous events. Other times I've used Facebook to send photographs of a town in Germany where some other ancestors come from to my nephews and nieces and their kids. Say, hey, here's this, and I've felt some reward from that, and the feedback that I've gotten from them has been very positive around this context, around this notion of providing some context of ancestry and being able to, if not pinpoint a specific person or personality like a Rebecca Nurse or a person who fought in a famous war, but being able to point their finger on a map and say, oh, that's where my ancestors came from, or that place.
Right. I wanted to also ask you, did you know anything or did you learn anything a little bit later on? It sounded like your knowledge of the Salem witch trials was, above average even while you were in grade school. So did you learn anything new as you researched your background that you didn't know? Or?
Yes. I've developed quite an interest in local history. I live here in Essex County. I live in Wenham. And my house is about 4 miles from the Rebecca Nurse house. Drive by it every time I go to the shopping mall. And in the context of an interest in local history, and yes, of course, the interest in Rebecca Nurse, but more in the context of local history, I've done quite a lot of reading, I think, or certainly more than the average, about the witchcraft episode and the years leading up to it and the years afterwards. And I've become, for a while, I was especially interested in the whole different causes and cultural factors leading into it. So I was very interested in reading about ergot, I was very interested in reading about the revocation of the charter and just the social unrest that that ensued during that episode, that just chronologically leading up to it. I've been very interested lately around interactions between Native peoples and the English colonists in Essex County, and which of those interactions went better and which of those interactions went worse.
Right.
That in the context of, and I'm tying that to the Salem episode as just something that was in the air in 1690s,
Right.
that there, just as the recent revocation of the charter was in the air. The thing, however, to get to my point, the thing that I've really focused in on that really interests me with regard to this episode is the thesis that Nussbaum, and I've just forgot the other author, developed around the clan factions of the accusers and Boyer, Nussbaum and Boyer. And the social and genealogical connections between those who were making the accusations and those who were being accused. And I just find that fascinating in and of itself, and because there's linkage to this theme of paranoia, but also living in the area as I do, I'm very interested to see how that factionalism did not end at the town line of Salem Village, at Danvers. Indeed, I live in a house that was built in the 1690s, where the wife of the sister of the wife of the couple who built it was accused of witchcraft. The house across the street from the 1680s or 1670s was built by members of the Porter family, and the land over in this direction from the house was owned by so-and-so. And so geographically, living where I do in the west part of Wenham, I can walk up and down my street and say, okay, that property used to be owned by someone who was on the jury.
Right.
That house was owned by someone who was defending the accused. And so this notion of factionalism is something that I could just, it is very intriguing to me. And that it did not end at the town line,
Right.
Around Danvers.
Right. It's interesting that you say that too, because Danvers, over time, they tried to disassociate themselves from that time in history.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask you your opinion on that. Do you think that they should try to embrace that, or do you think it was an appropriate thing for Danvers to do, to try to disassociate itself from the Salem witch trials?
Yeah, I'm thinking about your question. I can understand why that would happen, and don't let me dodge your question, but I'm going to go on a tangent. I'm going to go back to this Betty Nurse character that was researching my ancestor, and this in the context of a history book of the town that was written in the 1880s, where everybody had their family histories put in this book, except for those few nurse folks who were living in town. And the absence of their story in the context of this book, in my mind, is very glaring.
Yeah.
It's like, and it's almost as if someone said, one of these nurse characters said, "Oh no, we don't talk about our great-great-grandmother.
Yeah.
We just don't talk about that." And of course, I have no way of knowing this, but the absence of their story in the context where everybody else in that town was only too eager to tell their family stories makes me wonder, was there some level of embarrassment there? And which so getting back to your question, that makes me open to the idea of, okay, could there be a municipal level embarrassment in Danvers, that, and if so, I could be empathetic to that.
Right.
For a while. But after a while, guys, you got to get over it.
Yeah. Yeah. I see where you're coming from. Yeah. So yes. Also, I guess I can do the reverse of that and say in terms of Salem. Every October they have the haunted happenings during the month of October. Do you think that it's a good thing that the town has these celebrations, or do you feel like it's a little bit too, the marketing is a little, a bit much to where it kind of veers away from the actual history of the area?
I'm okay with it. I don't expect it to draw in hundreds and hundreds of history buffs. It'd be nice if it did. I don't expect it to, and I don't require it to. I do find myself driving around Salem every October for just to do regular everyday stuff. And so I see the lines of people outside different attractions that do try to tell at least some of the historical story around the witchcraft episode. So I'm under the impression that there is an incremental volume of people who are being exposed to the historical story. And I like to see that. I'm glad to see that. And not just because of Salem witchcraft for its own sake, and certainly not because of my connection with Rebecca Nurse, but rather in the context, larger context of, I'm encouraged to see people who show an interest in some aspect of history, whatever aspect of history that is. If there's, and I'm okay with people being interested in this history versus that history. So I'm encouraged to see what I think is some incremental interest in some aspects of the historical story that's being told out there. If someone like yourself were to tell me that the historical story being told at these events isn't 100% accurate, I believe you. I'd still be okay with that. Okay. That on the margin, I think there is some incremental history learning going on. As for the other gazillion people who are walking around in their costumes and so on, it's annoying if you have to go run errands in Salem. But it's only for a few weeks.
Right.
So I'm okay with it.
Okay. Is there anything else before we wrap up that you'd like to, say about Rebecca Nurse or the Salem witch trials?
I'm thinking about one of my nieces who lives on the West Coast, and I was talking with her by phone. This was a particular story happened about 10 years ago or so. So she was probably 6 or 7 years old, and she was asking me whether I had anything that belonged to Rebecca Nurse, or if I knew whether there was a spell book anywhere. And I was like looking at the phone, I said, what has my brother taught her? And I had to politely explain to her, no, I don't have anything that belongs to her. Yes, I do live near her house, and when you come visit me, I'll show you her house. And no, I'm very sure that there's no spell book, and that there was never any spell book. I really don't think she was that kind of a witch.
Right.
And I bring up the story because who knows? One day she or her kids may see a tape like this. May see this tape. But I also bring it up to think, okay, that myth of Rebecca Nurse was a witch, and a witch is someone who casts spells. It's like, my dear brother is spreading that myth out on the West Coast. Like, oh, great. So I just offer that up as it's still happening.
People are still,
They're coming up with these fictions
Right.
and encouraging the spread of these fictions, I guess for the entertainment value of it.
well, you know what, Mr. Corcoran, it's been an honor to have you here to do this interview.
Thank you.
And thank
It's
you.
been
very
my
much.
pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank
sir.
you.